Disclaimer: while we are not attempting to explicitly answer any questions concerning the memory or the consciousness of those with memory disorders, for those things will always be unknowable to some extent, we are attempting to provide at least a new or different framework so that we can better understand, or at least think about, the complexities surrounding memory, consciousness, and reality. We'd like to open this discussion about memory and sense of self within the context of Daniel Kahneman's TED Talk about your remembering self and your perceiving self. Link for that talk will be in the doobly-doo. How would you live your life if you knew that you weren't going to remember anything afterward?
This doesn't have to be a purely hypothetical question. People lose memories all the time, like in The Hangover, that movie. In serious cases like blackouts, people are losing entire stretches of time. Blackouts are basically amnesic episodes. People can interact, but they won't remember anything later. So they still remember things that happened before they black out, which means that these episodes are interrograde. So why do blackouts happen in the first place? It probably has something to do with how memory is encoded. Atkinson and Schifrin describes how our experiences make it to our memories. So, the experience enters sensory memory for just a few seconds, then it's transferred to short-term memory, and it's held there for a few seconds to a few minutes, depending on whether or not it's rehearsed. And research has found a lot of ways that things from short-term memory make it to long-term memory, some of it involving rehearsal and some of it involving depth of processing. But somehow some of the things here make it to long-term memory. But alcohol stops this process, called encoding, from happening correctly. The hippocampus is one major region responsible for memory formation, and alcohol specifically works on the CA1 region in the hippocampus, which might be one reason that can produce blackouts. So clearly, even though people can't remember what happened when they were drunk, the events still happen. But if they black out, they only know about these events when other people tell them about them. So their reality is formed not by their memory, but by what other people remember.
These blackouts and drunken episodes can be a segue into discussing amnesia. There are two types of amnesia: anterograde and retrograde. Anterograde amnesia is the type of amnesia that prevents you from forming new memories. Think 50 First Dates. Retrograde amnesia is memory loss in which you cannot access old long-term memories, like Anastasia. Thinking back to Daniel Kahneman's theory about the remembering self and how it makes decisions and tells your life story, we wonder how amnesiacs understand the reality in themselves if they cannot form new memories, or perhaps cannot access old ones. Yet, as Susan Blackmore, the author of a book on consciousness, points out, even if an amnesiac's perception of reality is wildly different, they are still conscious. They still perceive reality much in the way that we do, even if theirs doesn't persist. But who is conscious? Without the capacity to form new memories, the self is in some ways trapped. As the neurologist Oliver Sacks put it, if a man has lost a leg or an eye, he knows he has lost a leg or an eye. But if he has lost a self, himself, he cannot know it, because he is no longer there to know it. However, amnesiacs can still perfect a skill through working memory.
And this is an experience that regular people have too. You can learn a new skill, but not remember the process of learning it. For example, I know how to play piano, but I have very few actual memories of practicing. Clive Wearing is a classic example of retaining musical ability despite an inability to remember things. He had a brain infection of herpes, which left him with basically a 10-second memory span. So he can't create new memories, he can't remember anything from his past life, but he can still remember how to play the piano, and he can even learn new songs. Learning a new skill, like how to play the piano, is called procedural learning, and this is different from memories of what happened to us, which are called episodic memory. It's hard to imagine Clive's sense of self because he can play the piano, but he doesn't know that he can. And many people define themselves based on the skills that they have. Are we who we are because of what we know we can do, or what we can actually do?
Alzheimer's disease, as many of you probably know, is a disease characterized by the loss of brain function. This affects memory, cognition, and behavior. In late stages of the disease, caretakers describe patients as being in a fog, or no longer the person that they once were. We believe this is in part due to the patient's inability to remember the past. Their remembering self has been impaired. My uncle has early onset dementia, a form of Alzheimer's. He is unaware that he has the disease, which makes it much easier for my aunt, she says, because he's always perceived himself as being fine. He didn't realize that he was slipping away from his witty, opinionated self into being someone much quieter who rarely speaks. Now, what he says doesn't make much sense, and it's very difficult to know what he's thinking. My grandma, who experienced lots of memory deterioration in the last few years of her life, was aware that she was losing her mind, as she put it. It terrified her to be so powerless over her own cognition, and we would have to remind her of decisions that had been made that same day in her presence. A blogging website for people who want to write about their experiences with Alzheimer's features a patient who has Alzheimer's, who writes that Alzheimer's and having Alzheimer's is like having two illnesses. What is it to know like your consciousness is slipping? To know that your reality is no longer shared by those around you? This same man describes his struggles in a portion of a poem. He seems to acknowledge that his reality is not constant. Lifestyles changing all the time, never knowing what is mine, dreams and nightmares never ending, reality and truth always bending.
Memory loss also occurs with Wernicke-Korsakoff's, a syndrome usually resulting after many years of chronic alcoholism. It is a result of a deficiency in thiamine, or vitamin B1. Alcoholics usually get most of their calories from alcohol, meaning that they don't get a lot of vitamins from food. Alcohol also interferes with the ability for your body to process nutrients like thiamine, because thiamine is one of those nutrients that helps neurons energize and do their thing. It can result in problems with memory. Patients usually start out with Wernicke's encephalopathy, characterized by mental confusion, eye movement disorders, and ataxia, or poor motor coordination. As the thiamine deficit progresses into Korsakoff's, they experience anterograde amnesia, which, remember, means they can't form long-term memories. A lack of thiamine affects both the thalamus and the mammillary bodies in the brain. The thalamus is a sort of relay station for neurons to connect, and the mammillary bodies form a lot of connections from the hippocampus. So when something is wrong with the mammillary bodies, the long-term memories that are in the hippocampus can't make it to the cortex for long-term storage. Like with alcohol consumption and blackouts, the short-term memory of patients with Wernicke-Korsakoff's isn't affected, and they also remember everything that happened to them before they develop this thiamine deficiency.
Is the impairment of the remembering self that most people associate with loss of consciousness really you losing yourself, or is it the projection of other people who fear losing who you were?
And with alcohol-induced blackouts, you have no memory of that self during the blackout. You only know that reality through what other people tell you. So how much control does our memory have over our sense of self? And if our memories are faulty, what is the real past? As every philosopher of consciousness ever has discovered,
we are coming away with this project with more questions than answers.